Remember the toilet paper shortage of 2020? Empty shelves? Fistfights in supermarket aisles? People hoarding enough rolls to last a decade. That wasn't a supply chain failure, that was panic. And it moved faster than any truck could restock. When fear hits, stores empty in hours, not days. Here are the 15 items that will vanish first when panic buying starts. Item 15, bottled water. This one is almost embarrassing to lead with because it's so predictable. And yet, every single time there's a major emergency, bottled water is the first thing gone. Hurricanes, ice storms, boil water advisories, pandemic scares. The shelves are bare within 2 to 3 hours of any credible threat announcement. Every time, without exception. The reason isn't mysterious. Water is survival at the most basic level, and most people in developed countries have never had to think about where their water comes from. It comes from the tap. But when there's a credible threat that the tap might not work, contamination, infrastructure damage, a prolonged power outage affecting pumping stations, people go straight for the bottled aisle and clean it out. FEMA recommends storing 1 gallon of water per person per day, with a minimum 2-week supply. For a family of 4, that's 56 gallons. Nobody is buying that off a supermarket shelf in an emergency. The math doesn't work, the quantities aren't there, and you'd be competing with every other panicking family in the area. This is specifically a before-the-crisis item. The practical solution is a combination of stored water, large BPA-free containers, commercially available in 5 to 7 gallon sizes, and a water filtration system rated for municipal and natural water sources. A quality gravity filter like a Berkey or a Sawyer filtration system gives you the ability to process tap water, river water, or rainwater into drinking water, regardless of what the municipal supply is doing. The filter costs more than a case of water. It's also worth more than a case of water, by a considerable margin, when the cases are gone. The other consideration is water heater tanks. A standard residential water heater holds 40 to 80 gallons of potable water that most people never think about during an emergency. That supply is already in your home. Knowing it's there and knowing how to access it safely by connecting a hose to the drain valve at the bottom of the tank is a piece of practical knowledge that requires zero shopping. Item 14, canned and long shelf life food. The second shelf to empty after water is always canned goods. Soups, beans, vegetables, tuna, sardines, canned meats. These are the foods people reach for instinctively when they're thinking about a prolonged disruption, and with good reason. A can of beans costs under $2, lasts 2 to 5 years unopened, requires no refrigeration, and provides a complete protein source. The value proposition is hard to argue with. During Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the days that followed, food supplies in affected areas of Louisiana collapsed almost immediately. FEMA's delayed response left hundreds of thousands of people without access to food distribution for 4 to 7 days. The households that managed best were not the ones who had ordered last-minute groceries. They were the ones who already had canned and dry food stores on hand. Beyond canned goods, freeze-dried, and dehydrated food products, brands like Mountain House, Augustin Farms, and Thrive Life offer shelf lives of 25 to 30 years with proper storage and no refrigeration. These were once the exclusive domain of survivalists and people who used the word prepper without embarrassment. After 2020, they became mainstream enough that Costco and Walmart carry them in bulk. The stigma evaporated quickly once people spent 2 weeks staring at empty grocery shelves. Caloric density matters when planning. The goal is to store food that provides meaningful calories per unit of space. Dried beans, rice, oats, pasta, peanut butter, and cooking oil are the workhorses. Not glamorous, all of them extremely effective. A 50-pound bag of rice weighs 50 pounds and provides roughly 80,000 calories. A family of 4 at 2,000 calories per person per day burns through about 8,000 calories daily. That bag covers 10 days at full rations for 4 people. It also fits in a closet and costs around $25. Item 13, prescription medications. This one is different from the others because there's no improvised workaround. You either have your medications or you don't. And in a widespread emergency, the pharmacy supply chain is among the first things to break down. Delivery trucks stop, distribution centers close, and the pharmacies that do stay open face lines and empty shelves within days. In the United States, most insurance plans are structured to prevent patients from refilling prescriptions more than a few days before their current supply runs out. This makes intuitive sense from a cost control standpoint and makes almost no sense from a preparedness standpoint. The result is that most people who depend on daily medications are chronically running with minimal reserve supply. The practical approach requires a direct conversation with a prescribing physician, not a pharmacy. Many doctors will write a prescription for a 90-day supply rather than 30 days, particularly for maintenance medications for chronic conditions. Some will authorize an emergency supply if the request is framed honestly. I want to maintain a 30-day buffer in case of supply disruption. That's a reasonable request, and most physicians will accommodate it. The conversation has to happen before the emergency, not during. For over-the-counter medications, pain relievers, antihistamines, antacids, cold medicines, anti-diarrheal medications, the situation is simpler, but the urgency is similar. These empty from pharmacy shelves extremely quickly during any health emergency, as the 2020 shortage of acetaminophen and ibuprofen made clear. Maintaining a rotation of these at home, using them as needed, replacing them when you use them, keeps a functional reserve without waste. Item 12, batteries and portable power. When the grid goes down, people want light, communication, and information. All three require power. Batteries are one of the most consistent shortage items in any emergency affecting electrical infrastructure. Storms, wildfires, earthquakes, ice events, and the varieties that empty fastest are AA and AAA, which power the flashlights, radios, and small electronics that become essential within hours of a power outage. The American Red Cross identified battery-powered or hand-crank NOAA weather radios as one of the most critical emergency communication devices available to civilians. During widespread grid failures, particularly those affecting cell towers, a battery-powered radio receiving emergency broadcasts can be the only reliable source of official information. People who have them use them. People who don't have them discover in the dark that they should have gotten one. Lithium-ion portable power banks have added a second category of battery shortage to modern emergencies. Keeping a phone charged has become non-negotiable for most people's ability to communicate, navigate, and access emergency services. A high-capacity power bank, 20,000 mAh or larger, can charge a smartphone 5 to 8 times from a single charge. They're widely available for under $50 in normal times. During a grid emergency, they become genuinely difficult to find within the first day. Rechargeable battery systems, particularly the AA and AAA format rechargeable NIMH batteries with a compatible solar or hand crank charger, solve the disposable battery problem more permanently. The upfront cost is higher than a pack of alkalines. The long-term supply security is dramatically better because you're no longer dependent on retail availability. Item 11, flashlights and candles. The combination of grid failure and darkness triggers something close to primal unease in most people, which is why light sources vanish from stores before almost anything else during a power emergency. Flashlights, candles, lanterns, and headlamps, all of it, clears out fast. LED flashlights have largely replaced incandescent in the consumer market. For good reason. They produce more light, use less battery power, and last considerably longer. A quality LED flashlight from a reputable brand, Streamlight, Phoenix, Olight, will run for 50 to 100 hours on a set of batteries. A cheap flashlight from a gas station will last significantly less. In a scenario where battery resupply is uncertain, runtime matters. Candles are worth maintaining for a different reason than flashlights. They produce heat as well as light, and they don't depend on batteries. A standard household paraffin candle produces roughly 80 watts of thermal energy. Not enough to heat a room in any serious way, but enough to make a small space noticeably warmer and to provide comfort that goes beyond the merely practical. Beeswax candles burn longer and cleaner than paraffin. Soy candles fall somewhere in between. All of them work. The one that's in your cabinet is better than the premium one that isn't. Headlamps are consistently the most useful format for sustained use. Keeping both hands free for cooking, for first aid, for managing children in the dark, is not a luxury. Anyone who has tried to hold a flashlight with their teeth while doing anything useful understands this immediately. Item 10. Hand sanitizer and soap. The 2020 pandemic emptied hand sanitizer from every shelf in the country within 2 weeks of the WHO declaring a public health emergency of international concern in January 2020. By late February and early March, hand sanitizer was being resold online at 10 to 30 times the retail price. The FDA emergency guidance allowed distilleries to begin producing hand sanitizer under modified guidelines to address the shortage, and it still took months to normalize supply. The shortfall was partly demand and partly supply chain fragility. Most hand sanitizer in the United States at the time was imported or manufactured from imported raw materials. When the global demand spike hit simultaneously, the supply side had no capacity to respond quickly. Bar soap, which cleans hands just as effectively as hand sanitizer for most purposes, was far less affected because it's manufactured more broadly, stores more easily, and has a longer shelf history. The CDC has consistently stated that hand washing with soap and water is at least as effective as alcohol-based hand sanitizer and superior in some conditions, particularly when hands are visibly soiled or when dealing with certain pathogens. Soap doesn't require alcohol content, doesn't evaporate, and doesn't have a shelf life concern in any meaningful time frame. A practical approach. Stockpile bar soap in quantity. It's cheap, it lasts indefinitely when kept dry, and it works. Maintain a reasonable supply of hand sanitizer for situations where running water isn't available. Both are pre-crisis purchases. Neither will be on the shelf when you need them most. Item 9. First aid supplies. Bandages, gauze, antiseptic, medical tape, tourniquets, wound closure strips. These are the items people think they have until they actually look in the bathroom cabinet and find 3 bandages and a half-empty tube of antibiotic ointment from 2018. Emergency rooms become overwhelmed during major disasters. Urgent care centers close. Pharmacies run out of stock. The ability to manage injuries at home without professional support becomes an important capability very quickly. The American College of Surgeons Stop the Bleed campaign, a public training initiative launched in 2015, specifically addresses the window between a serious injury and the arrival of professional help. The program teaches 3 skills: applying pressure, packing a wound, and applying a tourniquet. The reason it focuses on these 3 is that uncontrolled bleeding is the leading cause of preventable death in traumatic injury situations. Professional help often arrives too late. People on the scene with the right supplies and basic training can change the outcome. A tourniquet, specifically a CAT, Combat Application Tourniquet, or SOFT TW, both of which have extensive military validation, costs around $30. It's not a complicated device. It's been standard issue for U.S. military personnel since the Iraq War, following research showing that proper tourniquet application dramatically reduces combat deaths from extremity wounds. In a civilian emergency scenario with no hospital access, this is exactly the kind of supply that turns a life-threatening situation into a manageable one. It also happens to be the kind of item that disappears from medical supply retailers within hours of any major emergency announcement. Item 8. Fuel. Gasoline, propane, and firewood. Fuel shortages in emergencies follow a predictable pattern. The threat is announced or the power goes out. People immediately drive to gas stations to fill their tanks, and their spare containers, and anything else they have. The stations run dry within hours. Delivery trucks are delayed by the same conditions causing the emergency. The shortage self-amplifies. During Hurricane Irma in 2017, gas stations across Florida ran dry days before the storm made landfall. The combination of mandatory evacuation orders and a concentrated population on a peninsula with limited exit routes created a fuel demand that overwhelmed supply almost instantly. People who waited were stranded, sometimes literally, on the highway, out of gas. Propane occupies a slightly different position because most households with propane appliances maintain a tank, either a standard 20-pound tank for a gas grill or a larger installed tank for heating. The 20-pound grill tanks run out faster than people expect under extended use and don't get refilled quickly during emergencies. Keeping a second tank, full, stored safely, provides meaningful redundancy. Propane has an indefinite shelf life when stored in a sealed tank, which makes maintaining a reserve straightforward. Firewood for those with wood-burning fireplaces or stoves is a different calculation. It's bulky, it needs to be dry, and it needs to be accumulated before winter. Wet wood burns poorly and produces more creosote, which builds up in chimneys and creates a fire hazard. Properly seasoned firewood, meaning wood that has been cut, split, and stored with airflow for a minimum of 6 months to a year, burns cleanly and efficiently. The window for acquiring and seasoning firewood is late spring and summer. By October, the well-prepared have stacked theirs already. Item 7. Baby and infant supplies. Formula, diapers, baby food, and infant medications occupy a specific and non-negotiable category in emergency preparedness. There is no substitution, no workaround, and no waiting it out if you have an infant and run out of formula. The 2022 U.S. infant formula shortage, caused by a combination of supply chain issues and a recall of products from Abbott Nutrition's Sturgis, Michigan facility, illustrated exactly how fragile this supply chain is and how quickly a localized problem can become a national crisis. At the peak of the 2022 shortage, out-of-stock rates for infant formula nationally exceeded 70% in some regions, according to tracking data from Datassembly. Parents were driving hours to find formula, rationing feeding, and in some cases being guided by pediatricians on alternative feeding strategies. The shortage lasted months. Families who had maintained a reasonable stockpile weathered it. Families who were buying week to week scrambled. Diapers follow the same pattern. During the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, diaper availability in many areas became inconsistent, and the formats and sizes that parents needed were frequently unavailable even when adjacent sizes were in stock. Cloth diapers, which were a mainstream solution until the 1970s, are a functional backup that most households with infants don't maintain and don't know how to use, but which work fine with basic instruction and hot water. Item 6. Toilet paper. Yes, here it is. The symbol of pandemic panic buying, the meme, the punchline, and also, as anyone who lived through March 2020 can confirm, a genuinely useful item that is genuinely unpleasant to be without. Toilet paper shelves at major retailers across the United States were bare within roughly 48 hours of lockdown announcements beginning in mid-March 2020. The shortage wasn't because supply had actually failed. It was because the demand spike was so abrupt and so concentrated that logistics couldn't adapt in time. The economist Stein van Nieuwerburg of Columbia Business School noted in 2020 that the toilet paper shortage was a textbook example of a demand shock cascading through a supply chain not built for abrupt shifts. The commercial and residential supply chains were separate systems. Offices, schools, and commercial buildings used bulk institutional format products. Homes used consumer format products. When everyone was suddenly home, the residential supply chain bore a demand load it had never been designed to handle. The lesson is not that toilet paper is a survival essential in the sense that water and food are. It isn't. The lesson is that panic buying creates shortages of even the most mundane items, faster than most people expect, and that maintaining a reasonable home supply of everyday consumables before any emergency is simply a practical and low-cost form of resilience. A 2-month supply of toilet paper costs the same as a 2-month supply bought week by week, and requires precisely one decision made at a normal time, rather than a stressful one. Item 5. Medications. Over-the-counter pain relief. Acetaminophen, ibuprofen, and aspirin are 3 of the most widely used medications in the world, available without prescription, inexpensive in normal times, and consistently cleared from pharmacy shelves during health emergencies. During the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, acetaminophen, Tylenol, and ibuprofen, Advil, Motrin became difficult to find in many markets, with retailers imposing per-customer purchase limits that were largely ignored by people determined to stockpile. These are not medications with exciting street value or interesting alternative uses. People hoarded them because fever management is one of the first things people reach for when illness strikes, and because the uncertainty of a health emergency, not knowing how bad it will get or how long it will last, drives people toward acquiring more than they need. The hoarders weren't irrational, exactly. They were responding predictably to uncertainty. The practical response is to maintain a rotation of all three, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, and aspirin, at home, using them as needed from the reserve and replacing them before they run low. These medications have shelf lives of 3 to 5 years from the manufacture date. The FDA has studied whether expiration dates on medications are conservative, and for most stable medications, including acetaminophen, the answer is yes, they typically are. This is not a recommendation to use medications past their labeled date, but it does mean that building a reasonable reserve and rotating through it is less wasteful than it might initially seem. Item 4. Communication devices, two-way radios and emergency radios. Cell networks collapse or become severely congested in major emergencies. During Hurricane Katrina, cell service was unavailable across most of the Gulf Coast for days to weeks. During the September 11th attacks in 2001, cell networks in New York City were effectively unusable for hours due to both infrastructure damage and demand overload. During wildfires in California in recent years, cell towers have burned along with the surrounding terrain. Two-way radios, the consumer-grade FRS/GMRS walkie-talkies available at most sporting goods retailers, provide short-range communication between family members or neighbors that doesn't depend on cell towers or internet infrastructure. Their range is limited, typically 1 to 5 miles in open terrain, considerably less in urban or wooded environments, but that range covers most scenarios where you need to coordinate with people in your immediate vicinity. NOAA weather radios, the battery-powered units that receive emergency broadcast frequencies, operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are a separate category that addresses a different need, receiving official emergency information and weather alerts when other communication channels are unavailable. The NOAA weather radio. All Hazards Network broadcasts continuously from a network of transmitters covering the continental United States. It is one of the most robust and reliable public information systems available and requires only a simple radio receiver to access. As former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate said in a 2011 interview, communication is what allows a community to function during a disaster. When communication fails, everything else fails faster. Having the hardware to communicate, charged, tested, and ready is not something to improvise after the emergency starts. Item 3. Personal protective equipment, masks and gloves. Before March 2020, N95 respirator masks were used primarily by construction workers, healthcare providers, and people in regions with chronic air quality problems. By the end of March 2020, they were entirely unavailable at retail for the general public in the United States, and the shortage affected healthcare settings as well. The CDC and state health authorities were actively asking healthcare workers to reuse single-use masks. Medical professionals were receiving them as donations from hardware stores and private individuals. The N95 mask, which filters at least 95% of airborne particles when properly fitted, is a specifically designed respiratory protection device standardized by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. The KN95, a Chinese standard equivalent, offers similar filtration under similar testing conditions. Both were in desperately short supply throughout 2020 and into 2021. Nitrile disposable gloves followed a similar trajectory. Latex-free, chemical-resistant, and available in multiple sizes, nitrile gloves are used in healthcare, food service, automotive, and laboratory settings. Global demand during the pandemic caused manufacturers, concentrated primarily in Malaysia, to run at maximum capacity for over a year while still failing to meet demand. Prices multiplied by factors of 5 to 10 in the early months of the shortage. Maintaining a supply of both, sealed, stored in a cool, dry location, is straightforward in normal times. N95s have a shelf life of 5 years from the manufacture date under proper storage conditions. Nitrile gloves degrade over time but maintain usable integrity for 3 to 5 years. These are not items that require frequent replacement or rotation. Buy them once in reasonable quantity and store them properly. Item 2. Cash. This one catches people off guard every time because it seems outdated. Why would you need cash when you have a card? Because card readers require electricity. Payment processing systems require internet connectivity. Banks go offline during infrastructure failures. ATMs empty within hours of any event that disrupts confidence in digital payment systems, and they're not resupplied on any kind of emergency timeline. During the widespread power outages following Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which affected over 8 million customers across the northeastern United States, functioning ATMs became a critical resource. People who had cash could buy gasoline from stations that remained open, could pay for lodging, could access whatever food was still available. People who didn't have cash had a card that worked nowhere. Small denominations matter. A store selling essential goods during a crisis, running on a cash-only basis because their payment systems are down, is unlikely to make change easily, if at all. Having 50s and 100s is less useful than having a supply of 1s, 5s, 10s, and 20s. The practical recommendation from most emergency preparedness guides is a minimum of several $100s in mixed small bills, stored securely at home and not touched except in a genuine emergency. This isn't a financial investment, it's an emergency tool. Item 1. Medications. Prescription and specialty items. Everything else on this list has a workaround, not this. A person who depends on insulin and cannot access it within days is in a life-threatening situation. A person managing a serious cardiac condition, a seizure disorder, HIV, or organ transplant rejection with immunosuppressant medication cannot improvise an alternative. The medications either exist in the supply chain or they don't, and in a major emergency, the supply chain fails in ways that are entirely predictable. The insulin shortage risk is particularly acute. The United States has approximately 8.4 million insulin-dependent diabetics, as of recent estimates from the American Diabetes Association. Insulin requires cold storage, between 36 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit, which means grid failures affect not just the supply chain, but also whatever home supply exists. Without refrigeration, most insulin formulations degrade significantly within 28 days at room temperature, though manufacturers have published guidance suggesting many can tolerate room temperature for up to 28 days without losing meaningful potency. FEMA, the Red Cross, and virtually every serious emergency management authority list prescription medications as the #1 personal preparedness priority, above water, above food, above anything else, for people who depend on them. The reason they top the list is irreplaceability. The time to solve this problem is during a routine medical appointment, in a conversation with a prescribing physician about maintaining an emergency supply. That conversation needs to happen now, not when the emergency is already underway. As former U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Richard Carmona stated in a 2003 congressional briefing on public health preparedness, a community that cannot access its medications in a disaster is a community that will generate medical casualties at a rate that overwhelms every other response system. That was over 20 years ago. The underlying problem hasn't changed. None of this requires a bunker, a survival compound, or a lifestyle overhaul. Most of what's on this list is available at any grocery store, pharmacy, or hardware store on a completely ordinary Tuesday. The difference between the person who has these things and the person who doesn't isn't money or paranoia or a particularly dark view of the future. It's simply the decision to act when acting is easy, rather than when it's already too late. Panic buying isn't irrational. It's what happens when rational people face a scarcity signal at the same time. The problem is that by the time the shelves are empty, your options are already gone. The preparation window closes fast, and it always closes faster than people expect. If this video was useful, hit the like button. It helps more people find content that's actually worth knowing. And subscribe if you want more videos on preparedness, practical knowledge, and the kind of information that doesn't get talked about until it suddenly matters. Be ready before you need to be.